Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. And as a reminder, I ask all members to keep themselves muted when they are not being recognized. The staff have been instructed not to mute members except where a member is not being recognized and there is inadvertent background noise. Members are also reminded that they may only participate in one remote proceeding at a time. If you are participating today, please keep your camera on, and if you choose to attend a different remote proceeding, please turn your camera off. Before we get started with the substance of the hearing, I want to welcome those who are observant. We'll note that we have a new ranking member on the subcommittee, my friend Andy Barr of Kentucky, who I'm sorry to see French Hill go, but I've got a long-standing and valuable friendship and relationship with Representative Barr. So Representative Barr, welcome. And look forward to working with you, as do the rest of the members of the subcommittee. So this hearing is entitled Schemes and Subversion: How Bad Actors and Foreign Governments Undermine and Evade Sanctions Regimes. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Sanctions are an important instrument in foreign policy, designed to be both a carrot and a stick in persuading an entity, an individual, a group, or a country to change its behavior. A step beyond traditional diplomacy, it also avoids the downsides of kinetic action. We've seen the success of our sanctions regimes in bringing the Iranians to the table and isolating human rights violators through the global Magnitsky Act, amongst others. Our sanctions programs can only be as impactful as they are effective. When designated entities evade our sanctions, we lose an important tool from our diplomatic toolbox, increasing the likelihood that military action would be necessary to maintain international order. Our hearing today will focus on those methods of sanctions evasion, ranging from physically changing the name painted on the back of a ship, the stern of a ship, to the use of shell companies to cyber-enabled crime, like the ransomware attacks that have been so prevalent in the news recently. This committee has worked to address some of these issues through the passage of the Corporate Transparency Act, authored by Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney, and the Anti-Money Laundering Act, sponsored by Chairman Emmanuel Cleaver as part of the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. These bills give law enforcement the resources and authority to better track money launderers, including sanction evaders, and their success will depend in large part on this body adequately funding their implementation. In addition, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, continue to do the extremely important work of educating market participants and putting out guidance on the newest typologies of sanctions evasion. However, serious threats to the efficacy of our sanctions programs lay just on the horizon and are approaching quickly. Though the launch of the Venezuelan, quote, Petro was an unambiguous failure, widespread use of alternative financial platforms could make sanctions evasion trivially simple. And though the Federal Bureau of Investigation was able to recover a portion of the ransom paid by Colonial Pipeline, we're likely to see continued growth in ransomware attacks from sanctioned entities as a way to raise funds. With that, I'd like to again thank our panel of witnesses. We very much appreciate you being here and your expertise. You represent that expertise in a wide variety of issues we're here to discuss today, and I sincerely appreciate your assistance in tackling them and look forward to your testimony. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Barr, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing today. Thank you for our witnesses for participation. And before we begin, I'd like to say that I am very excited to be back on the National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy Subcommittee. I appreciate the generous words of welcome from my good friend Jim Himes, our chairman. And as we discussed, there's a whole lot of opportunity on this subcommittee for bipartisan work and work that's very important in the interest of our country and the national security interest of our country. This subcommittee plays a crucial role in maintaining U.S. national security through economic channels and ensuring robust international development. China continues to pose a threat to U.S. competitiveness, and American sanctions policy is more important than ever. Additionally, the impact of monetary policy is becoming increasingly evident to the everyday consumer as increased costs are hitting their pocketbooks. This subcommittee plays a crucial role at the intersection of the financial system and national security and provides meaningful oversight over the Federal Reserve's monetary policy activities. I look forward to working with members of this subcommittee on both sides of the aisle to preserve a fair international financial system and ensure that the Federal Reserve remains independent and focused on its congressionally directed mandate. During my time on this subcommittee in previous Congresses, including as its chairman, we accomplished a great deal of significant and important work. The issues we discuss on this committee transcend party lines, and I look forward to working closely with Chairman Himes and all members of both sides of the aisle on our shared priorities. The U.S. employs a robust sanctions program to deny adversaries the funding, logistics, and resources to conduct illicit behavior or to compel them to change misguided behaviors. Economic and trade sanctions are enforced by the Office of Foreign Asset Control and are largely effective deterrents for bad actors. However, criminals and foreign adversaries continue to evolve and adapt and are able to evade U.S. sanctions through high and low-tech efforts alike. It's imperative that this subcommittee understand how bad actors are currently evading sanctions and ways that we can mitigate their continued evasion in the future. That's why I'm so grateful to our chairman for calling this hearing, which I believe will help serve that purpose, as each of our witnesses brings a unique and insightful expertise to the discussion. The U.S. maintains 4 major sanctions programs against Iran, North Korea, Russia, and Venezuela. These sanctions are a result of actions by those nations that are in direct conflict with U.S. national security and global economic stability. Despite the government's focus and coordination with our international partners on sanctions enforcement, our adversaries are able to skirt the restrictions put in place. Traditional methods of sanctions invasion include trade-based money laundering, through which bad actors move money through trade transactions, illicit shipping, including altering vessel physical identifications or corrupting other internationally mandated identification systems, or utilizing front companies to mask the true origin and recipient of funds. Bad actors have utilized these sanctions evasion techniques for years and have recently amplified their sanctions evasion techniques through the use of technology. As technology develops and adapts to changing threat frameworks, our adversaries change their playbook. For example, in the early years of the widespread use of cryptocurrency, bad actors would cash out their financing on major crypto exchanges. However, exchanges have increased their focus on regulatory compliance, including AML and KYC requirements, and this has chased criminals out of major exchanges into unlicensed exchanges, such as Russia's Hydra marketplace. Transaction volumes at Hydra and other unlicensed exchanges have skyrocketed in recent years as criminals identified and exploited vulnerabilities. I hope this hearing will shed light on how Congress can address these and other similar challenges. The instances of high-profile ransomware attacks, including on elements of U.S. critical infrastructure, signify the need for improved security and coordination between the private sector and the government. In the past year alone, victims have paid nearly $350 million in cryptocurrency to satisfy the demands of hackers using ransomware. That's a 311% year-over-year increase. Congress and the administration must keep pace with the changes and advances in technology as our adversaries find new ways to evade enforcement. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Again, I thank the chairman. Look forward to working with all of my colleagues on this new assignment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Today, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Dr. Jeffrey Taliaferro, a professor at the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. Next, we have Ivan Garces, the principal and chair of Risk Advisory Services at Kaufman Rossin. Next, we have Lakshmi Kumar, the policy director at Global Financial Integrity. We have Jesse Spiro, the global head of policy and regulatory affairs with Chainalysis. And lastly, we have Eric B. Lorber, a senior director at the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. A big welcome to all of our witnesses. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left, and a chime will go off at the end of your time. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony if you hear the chime, so that we can be respectful both of the witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. With that, Professor Taliaferro, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Hines and Ranking Member Barr, for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. It's a privilege to speak to this subcommittee and to be on this distinguished panel of witnesses. Let me state at the outset that I'm a scholar of international security. I'm not an economist, nor am I a scholar of political economy. And my scholarship and teaching focus primarily on U.S. national security and intelligence, the grand strategies of the great powers, both past and present, alliance politics, nuclear nonproliferation, and more recently, cybersecurity. My fellow witnesses are more qualified to testify about the design and implementation of sanctions, about the various strategies and tools that targeted actors employ to evade and undermine them, and to offer recommendations to the Congress and to the administration so that they might craft more effective sanctions in the future. My role on this panel is to provide a broad overview of the geopolitics of the United States' use of sanctions against a variety of actors. Sanctions have long been an important non-kinetic tool of coercive diplomacy, and the Office of Foreign Asset Control notes that sanctions are based, quote, on U.S. foreign policy and national security goals against targeted foreign countries and regimes, terrorists, international narcotics traffickers, those engaged in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and other threats to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States, close quote. The primary aim of sanctions, whether unilateral or multilateral, whether comprehensive or targeted, is to induce a change in the cost-benefit calculations of the target, and thus a change in the target's behavior. But as with other tools of coercive diplomacy, including kinetic force, the use of sanctions to secure a target's compliance is inherently difficult. My fellow witnesses will discuss some of the newer tools and technologies used to facilitate sanctions evasion, such as cryptocurrencies, central bank digital currencies, and ransomware. However, I'd like to highlight how shifting geopolitical dynamics are making it more difficult for the United States to credibly threaten and enforce sanctions, while also giving targets additional means and opportunities to evade and subvert them. Having won the Cold War and pushed the crumbling Soviet Union out of the ranks of the great powers, the United States emerged as the unipole, the only great power left standing in 1990-1991. And for better or worse, for 2 decades, weak systemic, that is international constraints, and the availability of opportunities to further improve its strategic position afforded the United States wide latitude in the definition and in the pursuit of its foreign policy and national security objectives. This extreme imbalance of international power, however, had several consequences which are relevant to the subject of today's subcommittee hearing. First, the United States imposed sanctions and even waged wars against recalcitrant states such as Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan, and non-state actors such as al-Qaeda and later the Islamic State with relative impunity. And even when confronting state adversaries against whom the use of kinetic force would have been prohibitively costly, such as North Korea and Iran, the imposition of sanctions became a preferred tool of statecraft for successive administrations and Congresses. Second, U.S. military command of the commons, along with American economic and technological dominance, gave various state and non-state actors an incentive to pursue asymmetric strategies. For example, the clandestine employment of cyber criminal organizations and individual hackers by the foreign intelligence services of Russia, China, North Korea, and other states. Third, this unipolar distribution of power gave targeted states and other disadvantaged actors an incentive to collaborate with one another to evade or subvert U.S. sanctions. And finally, as the Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance acknowledges, the distribution of power across the world is changing, creating new threats. The United States now faces 2 great power adversaries, a rising China and a declining and revanchist Russia, along with 2 regional power adversaries, Iran and North Korea. All 4, including their respective clients and allies, will seek to evade sanctions in the future. In this changing geopolitical landscape, it might behoove policymakers to perhaps lower their expectations about what coercive economic diplomacy alone can achieve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Barr.
Thank you, Professor Taliaferro. Mr. Garces, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Barr, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to talk about what I see banks doing to identify, block, reject, and report transactions subject to the U.S. sanctions. My name is Ivan Garces, and I'm a principal with Kaufman Rossin, a top 100 accounting, tax, and advisory firm, where I chair the firm's risk advisory services practice. I am also an executive committee member of the board of FIBA, a nonprofit trade association committed to supporting the international banking community through education and certification and advocacy. My comments today are based on my experience assisting financial institutions and other organizations evaluate, remediate, and optimize risk management programs, including those related to anti-money laundering compliance and OFAC compliance programs. Financial institutions employ an OFAC compliance program that is generally risk-based and commensurate with their OFAC risk profile. OFAC compliance programs typically begin with a risk assessment of an institution's customer base, products and services, nature of transactions, geographic considerations, and identification of higher risk areas of potential OFAC sanctions risk. Based on this risk assessment, financial institutions are expected to develop and implement policies, procedures, and internal controls for complying with OFAC. Sanctioned parties typically utilize complex structures and transactions to obscure their interest in the assets or omit information from transactions to avoid detection. Two common methods utilized and discussed earlier are the exploitation of trade finance transactions and the use of shell companies. Financial institutions typically use a combination of sanction screening and due diligence to identify potential sanctioned parties and activity. Financial institutions generally screen customers against the OFAC list at three junctures. One is at account opening, as transactions occur, and thirdly, periodically as the OFAC list is updated. At account opening, a financial institution will typically follow their account opening procedures, which typically includes procedures to comply with customer identification program and customer due diligence program requirements, both of which are intended to enable the financial institution to form a reasonable belief as to the true identity of each customer and assess the customer's potential risk. Financial institutions typically also screen the customer and other relevant account parties, such as account signers and beneficial owners, against OFAC at this time. This process can become complicated when dealing with clients presenting with complex corporate structures, particularly offshore vehicles. Financial institutions also typically screen transactions real-time, such as wire transfers. Financial institutions generally utilize automated interdiction systems to screen transactions and relevant transaction data fields and alert the financial institution to a potential OFAC match. For example, wire transfer information that would generally be screened would include the originator and beneficiary bank's names, the originator and beneficiary names and addresses. Bank identifier codes, for example, and free text fields would all be screened for potential matches. In the case of trade finance banks, also generally screen relevant parties in the transaction, such as importers and exporters, vessels, shipping companies, freight forward, agents, and brokers. This latter process, though, is often cumbersome and manually intensive, as it involves inspection of physical documents and manual screening as opposed to automated screening. As I mentioned earlier, the OFAC sanctions list is updated periodically, and banks generally have controls in place to ensure their systems are uploaded with the most current list, and they screen their customer database on a periodic basis. But there are challenges in complying with OFAC. Maintaining a robust compliance program requires substantial resources. Banks must invest in in people, in policies, procedures, and controls, ongoing training, and automated systems to comply with OFAC. Compliance programs are tested by independent parties and examined by bank regulators. However, OFAC sanction screening is not foolproof, and even the most well-intentioned OFAC compliance programs may fail to detect sanctioned activities. With an increasing number of sophisticated bad actors, complexity of transactions, financial institutions can't be expected to connect all the dots. Sanctions compliance programs are pretty well ingrained in financial institution risk models, but evolution of sanctions compliance program is needed in other industries susceptible to OFAC sanctions risk. Government outreach and efforts to enhance corporate transparency and implement a national beneficial ownership registry is a step in the right direction. Lastly, we can benefit from increased cooperation between public and private sectors, such as is contemplated with the proposed OFAC Exchange Act and the Combating Illicit Finance Public-Private Partnership Act legislation noted for this hearing. Government should be in a position to be able to take, analyze, and interpret information received, not only from financial institutions, but other industry stakeholders, and connect the dots identifying trends and relationships across the financial system. Thank you again for inviting me to appear before you today. I would be happy to respond to any questions the members of this subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Garces. Ms. Kumar, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hines, Ranking Member Barr, and other esteemed members of the subcommittee for the opportunity today to testify on behalf of global financial integrity at this hearing. GFI has worked tirelessly over the last decade with allies both domestically and internationally to address the gaps and vulnerabilities in the global trade and financial systems that serve as a safe haven for criminal actors. The US sanctions regime is expansive and currently includes more than 30 different sanctions programs. Despite the ever-increasing reach of sanctions, with evidence showing that the number of sanctioned vessels and ports grows with an annual rate of 6%, oil exports by Iran and Venezuela and oil imports by North Korea keep increasing every year. Because much of the sanctions program is targeted at curtailing the ability to conduct international commerce, sanctions evasion techniques play an international game of hide and seek, exploiting regulatory weaknesses both in the US and globally, assisted by a network of gatekeepers and facilitators.
Ms. Kumar, I think you accidentally muted yourself.
Because of this close connection to trade, it is unsurprising that a leading mechanism to evade sanctions involves the use of TBML techniques. You think I'd learn after a year of the pandemic. TBML, or trade-based money laundering, is the process of disguising the proceeds of crime and moving value through trade transactions. It includes techniques like falsifying the origins of a commodity or good, over-invoicing, under-invoicing, and phantom invoicing where no goods really move but just money moves. TBML is particularly challenging because there are no international standards, even at the level of the Financial Task Force, and little regulation internationally. It is therefore the perfect ally for sanctions evaders. Unsurprisingly, some of the largest sanctions evasion schemes most recently involving Iran used TBML techniques, and the Iranian government was able to pocket $100 billion by falsifying trade records. Similarly, the Venezuelan government, to get around US sanctions on its gold sector, has flown its gold all over the world, changing its origins. So the gold is now supposedly from the Caribbean, from Colombia, from Uganda, from Dubai, really anywhere but Venezuela. This comes at a time where US imports of gold during the pandemic have increased exponentially and by some measures over 600%. Erasing its history in this way means that the US has no way of knowing whether the gold it imports is the same gold that it is seeking to sanction. Sanction entities continue to look at the US as a safe haven to get around sanctions. Key in this are the weaknesses of the real estate sector and investment industry. Professionals that have helped Iran and North Korea evade sanctions invested their lucrative commissions in real estate through the EB5 investor program, which invests in commercial real estate and buying real estate in states like Alaska. Both commercial real estate and many of the jurisdictions where these investments take place are not part of the geographic targeting orders for real estate. Similarly, vehicles like private equity, hedge funds, venture capital funds that are exempt from carrying out customer due diligence obligations are also involved in sanctions evasion schemes. A recent FBI leak showed that London and New York hedge funds proposed using a scheme to sell prohibited items from sanctioned countries to the US. Finally, sanctions evasion does not just exploit the gaps in regulation. It exploits the lack of resources that enforcement agencies need to detect. The FinCEN files, while problematic, revealed two different sanctions evasion schemes tied to Russia and Syria that were filed as SARs by financial institutions, but did not necessarily receive the treatment they should have given the resource constraints of the agency. The way forward, therefore, is two-pronged, addressing regulatory gaps, but also providing the requisite support to enforcement, supervision, and oversight agencies. Towards that, we strongly urge 4 key recommendations to be considered. First, on FinCEN, create within FinCEN a national anti-money laundering data center that can carry out advanced data collection, analysis, and facilitate increased public-private partnerships. On beneficial ownership, continue to prioritize the implementation and the creation of a robust beneficial ownership registry. If sanctions evasion schemes, or really any other illicit finance schemes, have taught us, is that complex legal structures and anonymous shell companies continue to remain at the heart of it. But BO collection should also be extended to include other asset classes, like collecting BO information on real estate, art, as well as shipping vessels that are key for sanctions evasion. Third, customer due diligence should be required for investor advisors that are when they collect money towards vehicles like private equity or venture capital, and also for all real estate transactions. Finally, on TBML, it is necessary that we create a relevant set of red flag indicators on the use of TBML, highlighting the risk of free zones and vulnerable sectors like gold. Thank you again for your time today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Kumar. Mr. Spiro, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hines, Ranking Member Barr, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today on this very important topic. My name is Jesse Spiro, and I am the Chief of Government Affairs at Chainalysis. Chainalysis is the first blockchain analysis company. We provide data, software, services, and research to government agencies and companies in over 60 countries. We follow the money through human analysis, heuristics, and cutting-edge technology. Our tools have been used to successfully investigate and prosecute a number of high-profile criminal and civil cases. We've also enabled the safe growth of the legitimate cryptocurrency ecosystem. Our private sector customers use Chainalysis technology to comply with their regulatory obligations, to combat money laundering, and adhere to sanctions requirements. I'm honored to be here today to speak about sanctions evasion in this ecosystem. Today, I would like to address some common misconceptions about cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is one way that illicit actors evade sanctions, but the vast majority of cryptocurrency transactions are legitimate. According to our analysis in 2020, the illicit activity was just 0.34% of all transaction volume. This was a decrease from 2019, when illicit activity represented 2.1% of transaction volume. In fact, the transparency and traceability provided by the public blockchain ledger used by cryptocurrency like Bitcoin allows us to understand much more than in traditional financial crime investigations. Through blockchain analytics, investigators can follow the money. Bad actors who thought they successfully evaded detection in the past now find they've left a permanent trail for law enforcement and regulators to follow. This forensic technology, coupled with good regulatory oversight, is working. With that foundation laid, let me highlight a few examples. Through blockchain analysis, we can confirm that adversarial nations, terrorist organizations, malicious-enabled cyber actors, and transnational criminal organizations under U.S. sanctions have used cryptocurrency in an attempt to weaken the impact or fully circumvent sanctions, just as they have done through traditional banks, trade-based money laundering, and cash. Detailed examples can be found in my written testimony. In this challenging environment, OFAC and FinCEN have both made progress in targeting these actors. FinCEN through their BSA oversight and prescriptive crypto advisories, and OFAC through enforcement actions and the addition of cryptocurrency wallet identifiers to designations, which have provided significant intelligence that investigators need to understand this issue, and for financial institutions to properly screen for sanctions risks beyond name screening in the digital onboarding space. Using blockchain analysis, we can see the effectiveness of including digital currency addresses in designations. Our data demonstrates that after digital currency identifiers are included, financial flows cease to these addresses, indicating a positive impact of blacklisting wallet addresses. By adding digital currency addresses, OFAC creates awareness and adds intelligence value for investigators and the private sector. Due to the immutable provenance of the blockchain, additional research can identify other cyber activities related to designated actors and entities. I would like to recommend several ways to further strengthen the current sanctions regime, including 1, encouraging collaboration and information sharing with international partners. To date, OFAC is the only sanctioning body that has listed digital currency addresses in designations. Cryptocurrency is global, and through collaboration, we expect more successful investigations and seizure of funds. 2, increasing public-private partnerships through proposed legislation like the Combating Illicit Finance Public-Private Partnership Act and proposed OFAC Exchange Act. 3, increasing funding to OFAC to support more comprehensive targeting and designation packages. And 4, the creation of a national crypto targeting center that would enable interagency collaboration to combat the illicit use of cryptocurrencies. This organization would provide training, intelligence, policy support, and facilitate information sharing across law enforcement and regulatory agencies. In closing, I encourage you to consider the impact any potential legislation could have on technical innovation. Our adversaries have quickly embraced cryptocurrency. Thoughtful regulation that promotes American innovation while supporting law enforcement and financial regulators will be crucial for the United States to maintain its position as leader of the global financial system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spiro. Mr. Lorber, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for a summary of your oral testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Barr and distinguished members of the committee. I'm honored to appear before you today to discuss how bad actors in foreign governments undermine and evade sanctions regimes. I come before this committee as an economic sanctions and compliance professional, having worked at the U.S. Department of the Treasury and advised financial institutions, corporations, and humanitarian organizations on ensuring they operate in compliance with U.S., EU, and UN sanctions obligations. While sanctions can be a powerful tool for achieving U.S. foreign policy objectives, our adversaries are continually developing strategies and tactics to blunt their impact. These adversaries use a range of sanctions evasion techniques, many of which rely on obfuscation and opacity, to surreptitiously move funds and goods across the world, frustrating the impact of U.S. sanctions. Countering these efforts is critical to ensuring that U.S. sanctions remain effective in pressuring terrorist organizations, rogue regimes, human rights abusers, and the corrupt. At its core, sanctions evasion is about hiding the identity of the sanctioned parties involved. Many companies and individuals understand that they are prohibited from conducting transactions with sanctioned persons or in sanctioned jurisdictions, and that they face significant risks for doing so. As a result, sanctions evaders undertake substantial efforts to hide their identities and access global markets. While U.S. adversaries have developed myriad approaches for evasion, over the last few years, the U.S. government has focused on a number of key circumvention methods, including in the maritime and financial sectors, as already discussed. One area of concern, in addition, is in the cryptocurrency space, where we have seen rogues like Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State increasingly utilize crypto assets to evade sanctions. Understanding and mitigating the risks that these cryptocurrencies may pose, and in particular innovations like decentralized finance, will be important in stopping sanctions evasion. The US government, its allies and partners, and the private sector must adopt a multi-layered defense in-depth approach to effectively counter sanctions evasion. Each layer of defense decreases the chances that a terrorist organization or rogue regime can access global markets. And while each layer may not be foolproof, together they can pose formidable obstacles. Elements of this approach include effective intelligence collection. Key to countering sanctions evasion is the ability to detect such activity. The Treasury Department's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, along with other members of the intelligence community, as well as FinCEN, should be provided with the tools necessary to identify sanctions evasion. A legislative proposal under consideration by this committee, the OFAC Fusion Center Act, could help achieve this. This legislation would create an interagency group designed to share data and allow for better detection and disruption of illicit networks, providing the private sector with the right tools. In recent years, Treasury has armed the private sector with information on sanctions evasion tactics and red flags that can help companies spot such evasion through a series of advisories. Combined with clearly signaling to the private sector their compliance obligations and pursuing aggressive enforcement actions against those who fail to comply, this additional information can help the private sector more effectively counter evasion. To that end, the potential creation of an OFAC exchange, which mirrors the FinCEN exchange, designed to help provide the private sector with information on illicit activity, red flags, and trends could be an effective way to supplement these advisories and provide additional information on sanctions evasion. Identifying and tackling cryptocurrency sanctions risks. Treasury has rightly been focused on the opportunities and risks presented by cryptocurrencies, and certain elements of the crypto sector, such as decentralized finance, may pose particular sanctions risk, in part because those products are designed not to need traditional gatekeepers, such as centralized exchanges, as Mr. Spiro was talking about. These gatekeepers often understand and implement sanctions compliance programs and have served as key force multipliers of US sanctions, ensuring that a wide range of individuals and companies abide by their obligations. Determining how to ensure that new crypto market players are complying with US sanctions while not stifling innovation will be an important step in combating sanctions evasion and ensuring a robust crypto marketplace. Congress, the administration, and the private sector must all work together to help identify, disrupt, and deter sanctions evasion. While this is a challenging task, an approach that emphasizes aggressive designations, clear communication to the private sector, and efforts to ensure regulations and guidance that effectively address risks with new and innovative products will best position the United States to continue to have powerful sanctions tools. I look forward to your questions, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Lorber. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, and I'd like to start actually with you, Mr. Lorber, and maybe ask Mr. Spiro to chime in here. The committee is particularly interested in understanding and evaluating cryptocurrency. You talked about it. Is there any way to quantify the amount of sanction evasion that is occurring in all of the various cryptocurrency mechanisms that are out there? Question number one. Question number two, is there a way to get a sense for the rate at which sanction evaders are migrating to those platforms? And then finally, what would you recommend beyond what's in your written testimony, or what would you highlight as ways of mitigating the risk of cryptocurrency use for this purpose?
Great. Thank you, Chairman. It's a great series of questions, and I will also turn to the other witness for his thoughts on this as well. In terms of quantification, I do think that in fact, Chainalysis has a recent report that they put out which suggests that the number of transactions which are illicit that use Bitcoin or blockchain technology is actually fairly low percentage-wise. It's I believe, below 1% or somewhere around there. So it's fairly small. In terms of specific recommendations, it's interesting to think about. There are two sort of sets of recommendations that I would focus on. One relates to ensuring that things like centralized exchanges are actually developing and employing sanctions compliance programs so that they can identify and stop sanctions evasion activity that's going through those centralized exchanges. And data analytics firms like Chainalysis do that type of work. In addition, though, there's a series or a set of types of activities that are outside the scope of what those centralized exchanges are seeing, and that's where you also have a risk for sanctions evasion activity, like I was mentioning with decentralized financial products. There, it's going to be partly a focus on regulation, but it will also be partly a focus on education to make sure that those actors who are working in those spaces understand that if they're U.S. persons, they too have sanctions obligations and can be held to account if they violate them.
Mr. Chairman, I'll hop in, and I appreciate that question. In relation to specific volumes, we do produce data explicitly in relation to both the illicit and illicit that we see. And in relation to sanctions, well, I don't have that information directly available now. I can provide it via written testimony after confirming with my colleagues. In relation to recommendations, I believe that my fellow witness hit the nail on the head. When we talk about this ecosystem more broadly, the choke points are these exchanges, these centralized exchanges that provide the on-ramps and off-ramps in relation to conversion. And so these are critical in relation to any of the other kinds of activity that happen within the ecosystem. And in relation to effective investigations, by being able to determine via blockchain analysis and analytics when illicit activity transacts with those choke points, that is how the information behind those bad actors and individuals is obtained, and that is how successful investigations in turn are prosecuted.
Thank you, Mr. Spiro. In my remaining 1.5 minutes or so, Mr. Garces, I'll send a question your way. You've noted that even with banks that have robust compliance programs, once there's a match between a customer and somebody who's on the specially designated national list, at that point, it becomes very, very human and intensive of figuring out what's going on and ensuring that illicit activity doesn't take place. What can you tell us about what the barriers are to further automation, the use of AI, and what should we be doing to help in that regard?
Thank you, Chairman Himes. That's an excellent observation and question. The challenge is automated systems can only do so much. And what they do is they detect potential matches. It's then up to a human to investigate the particular transaction and determine whether the potential match is in fact a true match or perhaps a false positive. Advances in the technology and in the screening systems is definitely needed, and I believe artificial intelligence can help in that respect. Most systems today rely on matching algorithms and fuzzy logic to determine potential matches and certain sensitivity levels. What happens at the next level, what the human does is collects additional information about the parties involved in the transaction to determine ultimately whether the transaction parties are a match or not. Having systems that can automate some of that process would certainly relieve some of the efforts by the banks.
Thank you, Mr. Garces. My time is almost expired. So with that, I will yield back the balance of my time and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Barr, for 5 minutes for questions.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the testimony of all of our witnesses on how we can improve our sanctions enforcement and prevent this evasion. I want to first ask about North Korea, Mr. Lorber. I sponsored the Otto Warmbier North Korea Nuclear Sanctions Act and Enforcement Act, which became law as part of the FY20 NDAA. The bill imposed some of the toughest mandatory sanctions ever on North Korea. Yet, in your testimony, you detail how North Korea continues to evade sanctions. We've heard about the way they use shipping sometimes as sanctions evasion and front companies. Given their track record, including those front companies, hacking and other tools, how can we better shut down North Korea's efforts to obtain hard currency or otherwise evade sanctions?
Thank you, Ranking Member. It's a great question. This goes to, in many ways, what I was speaking about in both my written and oral testimony about a defense in depth approach. Because North Korea, if there's one target out there which is incredibly sophisticated as it comes to sanctions evasion, it's North Korea, because they use front shell companies, shipping, cyber attacks, so on and so forth. In many ways, though, the best methods for combating North Korea evasion activity are information provision to financial institutions. So giving financial institutions clear typologies that the North Koreans are using in order to help them identify what looks like to be potential evasion activity, as well as providing information to financial institutions, not just about typologies, but also about specific North Korea entities that are associated with North Korea that appear to be front or shell companies as a way to roll them up. And I know that historically Treasury has done this through a series of outreach programs to financial institutions. In addition to that, there needs to be political pressure put on those who are supporting and continue to support North Korea. It's not a secret that, for example, China has created at least a permissive environment for North Korean operatives to work in the country. That was detailed most recently, I believe, in the UN DPRK panel of experts report from, I believe it was March 2021, as well as North Korea maintains a series of financial facilitators throughout the world, including in, I believe, in Russia and China and other jurisdictions that help North Korea evade US and UN sanctions. And these individuals need to be shut down, need to be targeted, and pressure needs to be put on the governments that are hosting them to kick them out of the country.
Yeah, that's the tough part. Is our sanctions bill was a secondary sanctions that applied to Chinese banks, and how effective that has been, I'm not sure. Especially providing information to Chinese banks, maybe not the total answer.
So I agree with that. I think that's correct. Let me clarify. When I mean providing information to Chinese banks, information to banks, I mean, in many instances, providing information to US and European financial institutions where the North Koreans are trying to access those institutions through, for example, Chinese banks. There's been a number of court cases which have detailed this activity.
Great, thanks for that. And then in terms of the effectiveness of sanctions, we've long emphasized that sanctions should ideally bring about behavioral change on the part of bad actors. The administration is largely responsible for determining how this works and implementing the directives of Congress. Mr. Lorber, based on your experience at Treasury, how effective are we, generally speaking, in tying our sanctions and the lifting of sanctions to clear goals and results?
I do think we are good at it. We're much better at it, certainly, than we used to be. And that's something that we tried to do, and I tried to do while we were at Treasury, was that clarify very clearly the sanctions targets. If you change the behavior you're engaged in, these sanctions will be lifted. In fact, if you look back at all the Treasury OFAC press releases that were designation activities for the last few years, you'll see that language very clearly included in there. So it's a message that we've seen, and it's been followed up by action, certainly during the last administration, when there were sanctions which were lifted. So, for example, sanctions that were imposed on Turkey, they were lifted when, in our estimation, the Turks changed their activities that we found objectionable and were the reason for the sanctions imposed in the first place.
And last question, what type of feedback does OFAC and Treasury provide to banks with respect to implementing and enforcing sanctions? And are there ways the government can do more to strengthen or improve that public-private partnership with banks?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do like the OFAC exchange idea, which I believe this committee has taken under consideration. The idea there, similar to the FinCEN exchange, is OFAC would get together with a series of financial institutions to address a specific illicit issue. In this case, maybe a sanctions evasion issue. So they would pick a number of banks or insurance companies that they believe may be seeing this activity or potentially have exposure to this activity, and provide them with unclassified and scrubbed information to get them to harden their systems. That's the type of information, the public-private information sharing, that I think would be particularly effective. And I think the other witnesses may agree. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but they may agree with that approach as well.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Before I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, I need to step away for a brief meeting. So I'll thank Mr. Auchincloss for assuming the gavel in my hopefully brief absence. And with that, we'll recognize Mr. Gottheimer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Just last month, the terrorist group Hamas fired thousands of rockets into Israel in just 7 days while using Gazans as human shields. Like cutting off their funding streams. The Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, works to accomplish just that. Still, we have a lot more to enhance and strengthen our sanctions. A lot more work to do. By my bipartisan legislation, the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act requires that the president submit to Congress an annual report for the next 3 years identifying entities, including foreign persons and governments, which knowingly and materially assist Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and impose at least 2 or more crippling sanctions. Mr. Spiro, in an effort to fundraise for its military operations and skirt sanctions, Hamas has reportedly received an uptick in Bitcoin donations since the terrorist group's conflict with Israel last month. What do we know about the volume of cryptocurrency being solicited by groups like Hamas, and is law enforcement equipped to track and prevent these payments?
Congressman, I appreciate that question. It is obviously very timely. And, in short, what I can say is we know a significant amount of information about those payments. We know volumes. It's around $140,000 or the equivalent since September of 2020. We know additionally some of the connectivity in relation to services, the services that were used in relation to those donors. And all of that information comes, again, from the power of the data, from the power of the blockchain and the blockchain forensics. Law enforcement, we work with both the public and private sectors, meaning they will both have access to anything that has been attributed to terrorist financing, which is the highest risk, and will support directly investigations and mitigation efforts.
And we know that there was cryptocurrency used and particularly by Hamas in terms of solicitation.
Yes. So there is legacy information in relation to solicitation of donations by Hamas going back a number of years.
Thank you. Could you discuss the evolution of terrorist financing through the use of digital assets and how they may be used by illicit actors to evade terrorism-related sanctions?
Yes, Congressman, and I also appreciate that question. You know, as with any other illicit activity within this ecosystem, you do see incremental growth in relation to the illicit economy as well. And as it pertains to terrorism financing, we have seen incremental adoption. It is relatively small, or I would even posit extremely small comparatively, not only to the other activity within the ecosystem, but to the illicit activity. But we have seen instances. I would cite the fact that law enforcement domestically has been capable and able to take down multiple campaigns connected to that kind of activity, utilizing blockchain forensics and their investigative capabilities. But we have seen, you know, this technology abused by a number of terrorist organizations.
To that point, are there other tools that we could provide you with, or that you could help with to stay ahead of the activities to evade sanctions as digital assets continue to proliferate in the world's economy? Anything else that you could use help with?
So, Congressman, that's also a good question. And I think, you know, from the private sector, we are continually enhancing and advancing and adopting new technologies to combat the illicit activities that we see in this ecosystem. I think the tools should be provided and applied to the public sector, to those investigators, to ensure that they have the resources, that they can produce the intelligence and the information. And to Mr. Lorber's point, when that is distributed, it makes it far more difficult for the bad actors to exploit.
You know, in addition to sanctions evasion, we also need to improve our sanctions enforcement. And too often we've seen the executive branch and both parties ignore congressionally mandated sanctions. For instance, despite the Iran Sanctions Act, many companies continue to do business with Iran with impunity. Today, China continues to buy large quantities of Iranian oil. Mr. Lorber, how can Congress, in the time we have left here, how can Congress better ensure that the executive branch enforces existing sanctions, and in particular, address China's purchase of oil from Iran and Venezuela?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a great question. It is one of the biggest challenges of many of our sanctions campaigns is that there are, in effect, sanction-busting countries. China comes to mind in terms of its purchase of Iranian origin crude. There are ways to do it, and we actually have seen China respond in certain situations, and they've responded to aggressive designation activity of Chinese companies. The quintessential example of this is I think it was September 2019 designation of COSCO Dalian and COSCO Dalian Management, the Chinese shipping companies, huge Chinese shipping companies, which were designated for transporting Iranian origin crude. They apparently stopped transporting that crude following designation and aggressive negotiations with the U.S. State Department and with the Treasury Department. So I do think there is
Mr. Lorber.
No, apologies for that.
The gentleman's time has elapsed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for 5 minutes.
Well, before I start my questions, I want to congratulate Mr. Barr on his appointment to ranking member of this subcommittee, and also thank my friend Mr. Hill for all of his leadership through the years. I'm glad we have both of you on this subcommittee working through these important issues and critical to the national security of our great nation. Last week, the Biden administration rolled back sanctions against some former senior national Iranian company officials and several companies involved in shipping and trading petrochemical products. I'm very concerned that these actions will allow Iran an easier path to avoid sanctions and further engage in a trade-based money laundering. I would much prefer President Biden continue the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against the hostile regime. So, Mr. Lorber, can you give us your thoughts on if you think these actions by the Biden administration open up the door for greater sanction evasion, or do you believe we still have tools at our disposal to monitor and influence the hostile regime's behavior?
Thank you, Representative. I do think we still have many tools at our disposal to stop Iranian sanctions evasion activity. The Iran program, the Iran sanctions program, is one of the most comprehensive in terms of both the primary and the secondary sanctions authorities. So there is quite a range of authorities in place to stop Iranian activity. The bigger question is, what is this administration's appetite for using those tools in order to stop that activity, particularly as they continue negotiations indirectly with the Iranians over a potential return to the JCPOA. And there it's a much more open question as to whether or not the administration will aggressively go after Iranian activity outside of the nuclear docket right now during the negotiations.
Okay. We've seen an increase in ransom attacks on American businesses this past year, and I've spoken with some small business startups around my district who have expressed concerns that they will never be able to protect themselves if a hostile actor attempts this type of attack on their business. They see companies with entire teams of people dedicated to cybersecurity being compromised and feel hopeless if they become the next target. So, Mr. Spiro, is there anything we can be doing from the federal level to help these businesses, small businesses, that may not have the resources to put towards cybersecurity, or some more established companies to defend against ransomware and other cyber attacks?
Congressman, I appreciate that question. And obviously that is top of mind given some of the recent critical infrastructure attacks that we've seen via ransomware. I would say that my recommended approach to mitigating this kind of activity is twofold. The first is to improve domestic cyber hygiene, because in fact, ransomware has been occurring since 1989, in fact, in some form or fashion. But given our data and what we saw as of 2020, there has been a significant increase, which I believe was cited earlier. The other piece is disrupting the supply chain. And what I mean by that is because we have that visibility into the payments in relation to ransomware, when that information is identified, a lot of additional intelligence is born. We are able to see not only the money laundering networks, we are able to make connectivity between strains, identify the administrators and the affiliates in relation to these attacks, as well as the procurement vehicles used in relation to things like bulletproof hosting and VPN services. So collectively utilizing this kind of information, targeted approach can be taken to arresting different components and making this kind of activity less viable for the bad actors and the ransomware operators and groups. In fact, I believe today there was a takedown in relation to a ransomware related network wherein one of the money laundering networks was disrupted. So that would be a recommendation I would make. And that comes from law enforcement.
All right, thank you. Banks and the private sector play a critical role in keeping hostile actors out of the financial system. As this process gets more complicated, banks are investing more and more into machine learning and automated intelligence as they try to scan for bad actors. So my final question, Mr. Garces, can you discuss some of the benefits or pitfalls of machine learning and trying to automate this process compared to a manual screening?
Thank you, Representative Williams. That's a great question. There is much to gain from automation in this process. Banks are already utilizing systems to help in monitoring of transactions, their screening of transactions for potential illicit activity. But there is still a large human burden in the investigative process. I would encourage, or I would hope that government can continue to encourage innovation amongst the private sector in terms of its compliance programs.
Mr. Garces, the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Mrs. Dean, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chair and I congratulate the ranking member. I thank all of you who have testified before us today for your thoughtfulness and your answers. Ms. Kumar, I'd like to start with you. In your testimony, I read with interest how you discussed the role that United States real estate, especially commercial real estate, plays in sanction evasion regimes. You specifically mentioned the Geographic Targeting Order, GTO, issued by FinCEN, which I might note includes 12 metropolitan areas only, to require U.S. title insurance companies to identify natural persons behind shell companies used in all cash purchases of residential real estate. Given the limited metropolitan list covered by GTO and the fact that commercial real estate is not covered, can you speak to both of those problems? Number one, the limited number of metropolitan areas, my own suburban Philadelphia or Philadelphia not among them, and also the fact that it's residential, not commercial. Where does this fall short in terms of our regulating evasion?
No, thank you. That's an excellent question. And it goes to sort of understanding that sanctions evasion doesn't just, the sanctions program doesn't just target big actors like Iran, North Korea. The sanctions program also targets sort of individuals involved in drug trafficking. And what we see is a lot of those individuals often evade sanctions, including sort of former officials of the Venezuelan administration, all move or hide assets and move it into real estate. And the US real estate market is a popular avenue. Now, when we talk about commercial real estate, you're absolutely right in that the sort of often cited example of the Iranians owning that massive skyscraper in New York was a purchase of commercial real estate. It continues to be unrecognized. The EB5 investor program is investments that ultimately go into commercial real estate. Now, a lot of this is particularly complex because commercial real estate involves multiple investors. It is not as simple as a residential purchase by a homeowner. To that end, we have to what is necessary is to sort of rethink how we are going to apply the GTOs. The title insurance agents may not be the most relevant actors. However, to sort of identify gatekeepers that do continue to play a critical role in sort of putting together these transactions, because commercial real estate transactions are always take place through legal structures. They are never in the names of an individual. So identifying actors like lawyers who often play a critical role in this as sort of the pressure point at which you can conduct due diligence to know who is behind these transactions is one way forward. You've also rightly said that it only covers 12 metropolitan areas. And a lot of the evasion schemes that we often see tied to individuals, but also more generally, the use of real estate. You often see an equal split between cases that occur in GTO areas versus cases that occur in non-GTO areas. And I will say that we have a report forthcoming in the next month that shows evidence that when looks at a series of reported cases that actually shows that over the last 5 years, the number of cases that occur in non-GTO areas are actually slightly significantly more than GTO areas. So there's a whole host of vulnerabilities that do need to be addressed.
Exactly, those vulnerabilities, we have to take a look at what are the appropriate metropolitan areas, how do we include other real estate transactions, including commercial real estate transactions, how do we make gatekeepers have accountability, responsibility in their own professional ethics. Mr. Garces, following up on these items, how can the United States government better communicate with the financial services industry actors and other industry gatekeepers about the risks they may encounter or the feedback on how they should be making decisions in terms of these complex transactions in order to look for sanctions evasions?
Thank you, Representative Dean, for that question. I think FinCEN, there is a good amount of outreach that happens where FinCEN puts out and Treasury puts out information in very general form to the financial institutions. But that information can be enriched through a stronger private-public sector type of program, like what was discussed with the OFAC Exchange Act. I think that would be really helpful. I think institutions need the information that's collected at the national level because institutions only see what they see within the four walls of their organizations.
I thank you very much, and I see my time has just but expired. Thank you all for your important information today, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes. Is Mr. Davidson available? I'm not sure we have any members on right now. The subcommittee will stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
We'll come to order. Again, thank you to the witnesses for your forbearance. Apologize, we're in the midst of votes. And with that, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
I thank the gentleman and I thank our witnesses. I first would ask unanimous consent to submit 2 articles for the record. The first is the FinCEN files that appeared in BuzzFeed on September 20th of last year, and the second appeared today in the Wall Street Journal, titled Untraceable Bitcoin is a Myth. So we've supplied both those to the committee.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Our current sanction regime contains faulty elements that often unintentionally harm American citizens and businesses. Too often we see bad actors evade our sanctions infrastructure through trade-based money laundering, illicit shipping, or front companies in third-party countries, and numerous other ways. Thankfully, as this hearing shows, I'm not alone in recognizing the need to discuss and reform our outdated systems. This past April, it was encouraging to see the Deputy Secretary of Treasury announce that Treasury would conduct a top-to-bottom review of Treasury sanctions programs. Given the failures in the current BSA, AML, KYC framework and gaps, we should understand that doubling down on the same tools of surveillance, reporting, and control mechanisms in our financial systems will prove inadequate. The government should stop trying to control the tool that is money in the financial system and instead focus on targeting the illicit acts and actors. We must explore an alternative approach to BSA, AML, KYC, and the sanctions regime so that we could have a flexible, targeted, and effective approach. Currently, the SDN lists statistics as of yesterday, the 15th. We have 277 aircraft, 3,668 entities, 4,603 individuals, and 406 vessels. Mr. Lorber, regarding OFAC's specially designated nationals list, are individuals or entities that are added to that list regularly monitored? Is there an end goal in mind whenever OFAC designates someone or something to that list?
Thank you, sir. It's a great question. I mean, the end goal is twofold. One of two. It's either to prevent them from engaging in illicit activity, right? So you mentioned an aircraft. Prevent that aircraft from shuffling or sending illicit drugs to a destination. Or it's to get the targets to actually change their behavior. So to essentially impose restrictions on them to get them to say, well, this is not worth it. We are no longer going to engage in material support for terrorism, for example. So there are end goals that are put into place, and Treasury, OFAC does, as a matter of course, review certain designations to see, if they remain current, if the companies that were designated, for example, are no longer in existence, things along those lines.
Thank you. And I wish I could have time to explore how the licensing system tries to minimize collateral damage to Americans. But due to it's an old law, 1975. We haven't really updated staffing. We've increased our sanctions by a lot. And it is tedious to try to prevent collateral damage to American citizens and American companies. But I do want to highlight some things with Chainalysis, and particularly the emphasis on cryptocurrency. Mr. Spiro, we hear a lot about ransomware attacks. Cryptocurrency skeptics are always fast to jump on a story involving a ransomware attack whenever cryptocurrency is used for the payment. However, the facts speak for themselves, and we know that crypto does not provide an advantage to illicit actors. Chainalysis does an excellent job of making this point. Do you think some people are too easily distracted with an anti-cryptocurrency narrative?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question, and thank you for your efforts thus far in your time on the Hill in relation to the broader adoption and knowledge around cryptocurrency and this technology. I think that when you look at kind of the legacy of cryptocurrency thus far, there has been continual pushback in relation to, the potential threats that have been posed, and the previous ecosystem when there was less compliance, fewer regulations around this space. and less of an understanding in relation to the technology underlying and the transparency and traceability. In relation to ransomware, I cited previously the fact that the first ransomware attack happened in 1989 and obviously did not utilize cryptocurrency to facilitate payments.
Thanks for that. My time has expired, but you make great points, as you will undoubtedly through the hearing. The United States seized over $1 billion in crypto last year, so clearly there's a way to do it. I yield.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Auchincloss, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chair and to our witnesses for their thoughtful testimony and also for their patience as we work out these logistics. I actually want to build on what my colleague, Mr. Davidson, was asking about with Know Your Customer and blockchain. And Mr. Spiro, I'd like to engage with you on these questions. And because there might be a few of them, I'd ask with respect that you try to keep your answers relatively concise. So is Know Your Customer harder with blockchain for technical reasons, for political reasons, or not at all?
Congressman, that is a wonderful question. And in relation to it, I think that KYC, that kind of collection, is now a different challenge because we pivoted from the brick and mortar institution into digital finance. As such, synthetic identities and fraudulent identities and deepfakes are problematic. They were cited, in fact, in relation to a recent designation on Second Eye Solutions. And those kinds of providers providing that kind of fraudulent information mean that bad actors, including sanctioned actors, could circumvent those kind of controls at exchanges.
So, okay, so you're saying that there are technical reasons why blockchain would be a good vector for bad actors to evade KYC. And am I right in saying that there's also political reasons why it's hard to do KYC because states like Russia, for example, are not providing the international cooperation we need to find these actors?
I think in relation to the regulation in this space that different jurisdictions are choosing to apply or not apply, those that have regulatory arbitrage, unclear regulation, or have chosen to ban cryptocurrency run inherent risks in that you will see illicit activity funnel into those jurisdictions. The Financial Action Task Force, conducts mutual evaluations in relation to money laundering. Potentially, this would impact mutual evaluation if it would continue. But it is something that we have seen in different jurisdictions that have either chosen not to apply regulation, to ban cryptocurrency, for example.
You had also mentioned in your recommendations that getting more sanctioning bodies to list the digital currency addresses would be a major step forward. Can you speak more to that? What would be the sanctioning bodies that would need to list these digital currency addresses? And has there been any kind of progress on that front, especially with states with whom the United States does not have a good relationship right now and where a lot of these actors are operating from?
So I can't speak to progress with other nations or those that the U.S. may not have such cooperation with. I do know that other sanctioning bodies like the UN are becoming more familiar with abuse by countries that are under sanction, for example, in relation to virtual assets. So, I can say that.
Okay. I want to circle back to the first question I asked because I'm not sure I totally understood the answer to it. If you were a criminal operating in a polity who was regulating KYC well, such that you did not think you had an off-ramp to do a mixed fund or to wash it out, would blockchain offer you an advantage in obfuscating your identity over a different type of currency?
No, I would actually posit the complete opposite, Congressman. What I would say is that the only vulnerabilities that I would address in relation to KYC are the fact that people could circumvent them. But even if they were to, if they're engaged in illicit activity that can be seen in relation to illicit crypto activity, it is going to be very difficult for them to do anything within the ecosystem.
Got it. Okay. If you were the head of OFAC, what would be the next step, or if you were able to advise Congress to take any steps that would influence OFAC's measures, what would you advise that we do?
I would just advise to apply, Congressman, more resources to that agency, specifically in relation to the risks associated with cryptocurrency and sanctions evasion, wherein they can produce more designations that include cryptocurrency wallets. Because as identifiers for the private sector, when they have access to that information, that is how they can potentially mitigate the illicit activity. And because of the activity with cryptocurrency, when a wallet is put on that designation list, any associated activity, or within a designation, excuse me, any associated activity and legacy activity in relation to that look back can also be
visible. Yeah. So you're saying OFAC can build KYC for the blockchain. I yield back my time to the chair.
Gentleman, time is expired. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate our witnesses. It's a great panel. I appreciate their patience as we go through our constitutional duty of running back and forth to vote. And Mr. Lorber, I really enjoyed reading your testimony. I thought your outline of America's sanction regimes was very helpful to members, particularly new members on the committee, in terms of the different kinds of sanctions that are imposed by the legislative and the executive branch. You referenced a UN report from March, and this is, I assume, looking back at the UN sanctions on North Korea. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a 1718 committee.
And what is your view of, have we held together on this topic at the United Nations? Would it be good if the Biden administration's new ambassador asked for a Security Council meeting on this particular topic to assess where we are on it, or will they do that automatically having issued that report?
Well, so the panel of experts reports on that committee, they issue the report and they brief member states. I'm not sure if there's an automatic Security Council meeting to discuss it. I will say in response to your first question, though, I mean, I think it's fairly evident based on the report itself that members of the Security Council, in particular China and Russia, don't at best don't appear to be enforcing UN sanctions related in particular to North Korean financial facilitators that are operating in those jurisdictions.
And is that equal land-based and maritime, or mostly maritime?
It's a combination. So as I mentioned before, North Korea is extremely sophisticated in how they conduct sanctions evasion. So they'll combine strategies. They'll do maritime obfuscation along with the use of front-end shell companies with foreign financial facilitators. It's oftentimes packaged into sort of one extremely complex and sophisticated evasion network.
And are we not doing sort of an adequate job? When I say we, it means the United States and other major financial jurisdictions that have good AML, BSA work. We, most of these things can pass through a European or an American touching institution, for example, somehow, somewhere. Are we not doing a good enough job on the secondary punishment, secondary sanction arena in those Russian and China actors? And if so, I know we don't have much clout to get them to punish them, but tell me where you think the choke point of weakness is, aside from the fact that North Korea is great at using front companies and shell players.
Yeah, so I think it's two separate choke points. One choke point is the access that the North Koreans actually oftentimes try to get to the U.S. financial system. There's this kind of myth out there that they're the hermit kingdom and they have no access to the U.S. financial system. Recent cases suggest that's actually not the case. So providing as much information, including typologies, but also very specific information that's quietly provided to U.S. and European financial institutions can be really impactful and helpful in helping them identify activity. But in addition to that, the second choke point is actually focused on Russia and China, who continually provide assistance, or let me rephrase that, at the least provide extremely permissive environments in which North Korean trade-based money laundering and front and shell companies can operate without penalty or fear of retribution.
And I take it the maritime aspects are really a needle in a haystack situation in terms of, I know during the Trump administration, as we attempted, the Treasury did a good job, I think, trying to name flag vessels and increase the heat on that. President Trump was not always on the same page with Secretary Mnuchin on that, but we deployed Coast Guard cutters to South Korean waters. but that's really not effective, is it?
It's effective in limited cases, but I will say one thing that state and Treasury and the U.S. Coast Guard did do is in early 2020, they issued a global maritime sanctions advisory. It was extremely detailed and long, which basically signaled to the maritime sector, you have sanctions compliance obligations. And if you don't follow those through, you may be at the pointy end of an OFAC enforcement action or a designation. And frankly and candidly, that sent a significant chill through the maritime sector to say, hey, we actually need to do a much better job bolstering our sanctions compliance, or else we're going to be in bad shape with U.S. regulatory authorities.
So that's a potential place through the Financial Action Task Force meetings and through our work with Treasury and our colleagues bilateral. That's a place where we could put more emphasis. Is that a good thought?
Yeah, I think that's right. Figuring out how financial institutions are actually working to reduce trade finance related sanctions evasions.
Good. Well, thank you for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time is expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congrats to my friend, now Ranking Member Barr. I know he's down on the floor, but excited for him in this new role. I want to start my questions with Mr. Spiro, and I want to talk specifically about DeFi. So there's a sense and a fear that DeFi by design does not allow for monitoring sanctions compliance. One, is that true? So just for the first question. And then the second one is, if not, how can we build that capability into OFAC as more transactions move into the DeFi space?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. It's a very good one, and it pertains to the emerging technology that we see on top of the pre-existing technology that we see in the cryptocurrency space. Admittedly, I am not a DeFi expert, but what I can say is DeFi provides software or claims to provide software which can then be used in a peer-to-peer capacity by those users in relation to trading. And as such, in relation to issues of accountability or sanction screening or transaction monitoring, vulnerabilities exist, and you could see how sanctions evasion could occur outside of other kinds of sanctions related illicit activity, like extraction attacks that could be executed by hackers, for example. I believe that DeFi, given the nature of that model, does not fall under some regulatory regimes, but the Financial Action Task Force has taken a position and said that these kinds of services are in fact virtual asset service providers, or has taken a position that is pending this summer, I should say, that these kinds of providers are in fact virtual asset service providers or exchanges and are therefore subject to AML CFT controls, which would include KYC, which is not currently happening in much of the space, and transaction monitoring and oversight.
Okay, so I guess sort of building on that, what sort of questions should we be asking of OFAC to make sure that they can in fact monitor sanctions via DeFi transactions? Because the promise of DeFi, and I think DeFi is a really cool concept, but obviously it has its challenges. The promise is you don't have the intermediate, you don't have the central intermediary. You just go peer to peer. So I guess what should we be asking OFAC to make sure they have this properly on their radar and are developing the capabilities?
That's a great question also, Congressman. I think in relation to the different kinds of activity, from what I've heard, OFAC and certainly FinCEN, who coordinates with OFAC and other agencies within the Treasury, is studying this kind of activity, is reviewing any potential illicit activity in the space. So I do believe that is happening. But again, in relation to what degree the focus is applied and the kind of information intelligence that is being built in relation to potential additional designations and packages is something to certainly consider, because the advancement of that technology right now in DeFi is rapid.
Very rapid. Mr. Lorber, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Congressman. I think Mr. Spiro really spoke well to it. I mean, in my mind, to a certain extent, it's a question of education as well as specific regulatory approach. So one thing that I've seen quite a significant amount of is firms who are operating in the DeFi space or are coming into the DeFi space or thinking about investing in the DeFi space don't have a sense of what their OFAC obligations are. Not that they don't know that they are US persons who are subject to sanctions. They know that, but they don't necessarily know how that's operationalized or what they're, what they should be doing for screening or for KYC and how they're supposed to do it. So I do think that in addition to some, regulatory clarity, there is a need to go out there and do some education once that clarity is provided to make sure that everybody knows that this is what's expected of you. And if you don't do it, well, then there may be, enforcement activity that follows.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think my time's about up. Mr. Lorber, I'm going to ask you one more question. Do you think we should be adding China to the list of countries that we currently sanction, North Korea, Iran, Russia, Venezuela? And if so, how would you structure those sanctions?
So I think there are many differences we have with the Chinese and many activities they engage in, which I think are where sanctions can be impactful. I would not recommend putting in place essentially a comprehensive embargo like the U.S. has on Iran and Syria and North Korea and Cuba, et cetera, on China. I think for all sorts of different reasons, I think that would be a mistake. I think the targeted way, and real time's up. I think the targeted way that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration are approaching sanctions towards China is prudent right now.
Great, thank you.
Gentlemen's time has expired. It appears that we have no further members with questions. So I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Thank you for your patience around the vote-induced chaos. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email address provided to your offices. With that, this hearing is adjourned.